Hello, and welcome back to Middleism Apologetics. I am your host, Stephen Whitsitt. I've been gone for 3 weeks, essentially. I ended up having to go down to Lincoln, Nebraska for training on a new job for the last 2 weeks, and then came right back and jumped right into a full-time position and been working my tush off like I haven't in a long time. Very rewarding work and much better than what I've ever done before. So in the meantime, as I get my schedule kind of taken care of and ironed out, I will be trying to do things in between. Now, for those of you who do not know, there was a debate yesterday between Sam Frost and Holger Neubauer from the Churches of Christ in Newcastle Trinity United Methodist Church in Indiana. Pretty good debate all the way across. I've listened to it one time. I still need to listen to it another time. It was kind of rough with the 2-minute, 3-minute rebuttals and those things that went back and forth there for about an hour or so with the questions and things like this. A little bit hard to follow, but what I want to deal with is that both of them gave a presentation at the beginning and for about an hour. And here I'm dealing with Holger Neubauer's his presentation and dealing with some things. Now, let me premise here, in what has gone on before in the video, he sat there and he talked about the importance of understanding the Old Testament, understanding how the New Testament authors, including Jesus, quoted from the Old Testament, and how we're to understand what they said based on the context of those things of the Old Testament, which is kind of shaky ground because when you're using apocalyptic language, and a lot of that language you can't iron it down to say this is exactly what this means in some cases because it is so broad and so vague in some ways. But the language can be definitely tough to deal with in some points. Especially I'm talking about in prophecy where they quoted Isaiah and such like this. But then, of course, like when Matthew used the prophecies to talk about Jesus, he was actually very concise in putting it in the context of Jesus' life and using those Old Testament prophecies to show and demonstrate how they were literally fulfilled and not metaphorically fulfilled. And so when you look at phrases like, the virgin birth and such, and not a bone of him will be broken, those are little prophecies that were literally fulfilled. And the language, of course, was very literal. So it is very hard process to determine between metaphorical and literal, and anybody says they got that all ironed out is completely crazy. But there are many things that we can. Now, that was his point, and he wants to argue, of course, based on that. And so he goes into this thing here, and he starts to bring up Zechariah 12, 13, and 14. Before we go into that, though, I want to point something out in regards to that, and I'm going to make this very, very clear. And I've said this point before all the way across the board. And this is written, and I'm putting this up there for people on that the website, Facebook. Let me show you. It's called Full Preterism, A Thing of the Past. Is where I do a lot of the discussions where people can come on, and we do a lot of the talking and discussing back and forth. And so people are welcome to join and request, and we can talk and discuss and things, and maybe not so many net cases, but there are plenty of those around still. It seems like we can never shake them off. So you can come join here. This is where I'm going to be posting things and taking a look at things and looking at it. Now, one of those things that we come up with and we've talked about is in Matthew 24:36. When Jesus said, Son of Man coming on clouds. And he used that, of course, in several other passages, including Matthew 26, when he was before Caiaphas, when Jesus responded back to him, are you the son of, the Messiah or whatever? And Jesus responded back, from this point forward, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Father and coming on clouds of glory. And to understand that whole phrase, of course, we have to go back to the Old Testament and look at what it is that he was talking about. But anytime you see that passage, Son of Man coming in clouds, sitting at the right hand, those are all references, and they understood this, to go back to Daniel 7, 13, and 14. Now, Holger also admits this. He, in his thing there, maybe a little bit later on, he in the video, he talks about Daniel 7:13-14, and he wants to argue that that it is judgment language, and it's all about the judgment. It has nothing to do with the ascension in here. But what we're going to look at here is exactly that, is what it is talking about, and this is what Jesus was quoting in Matthew 24 when he talked about the Son of Man coming on clouds. So let's look at that passage real quick. It says, I saw the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. Well, the Ancient of Days, of course, is God himself. So the Son of Man is somewhere else where he is now come to the Ancient of Days. Past tense, of course, he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and the glory and the kingdom, and that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Now, scholars agree, and I have quotes from many full preterist scholars who agree that this is the scene of the ascension. And of course, there are many mixed up ones that tried to deny that, and still trying to get the idea that this coming is coming down to earth when it says no such thing. This is Jesus coming into God's presence, sitting on his throne and receiving his kingdom, which is a direct reference to his ascension. And because he ascended, because the Son of Man ascended into heaven on clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, he was given that kingdom, and because of that, now he is the one who sends judgment. He is the one who issued the judgment against Jerusalem. And that's exactly what he was talking about in Matthew 26 when he was talking to Caiaphas. So we get that picture there. Understanding the context of what he said in the New Testament is what Holger, whatever his name is arguing about, is that we have to understand the Old Testament. Well, here it is, folks. What preterist is going to deny this? That's what I want to understand. Any preterist who denies this is the ascension scene like he does, it's not, I'm sorry, they're not being honest with the scriptures there. It's right there, plain black and white. And then the part I'm going to be going to is he's going to be talking about Zechariah 12, 13, and 14. Because again, these... It's actually 12:10. Look, and I will pour it on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, spirit of grace and peace from her, so that when they look on me, on him whom they pierce, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. Now, that was fulfilled literally, of course, when Christ died on the cross. We all know that. When they looked on him whom they pierced, they will mourn for him as one mourns for a child. Okay? His disciples obviously mourned. But then also, John uses it in Revelations to talk about his second coming. Now, how is this applied to his second coming? Well, of course, Holger here takes 12, 13, 14, and he wants to tie all three of these chapters into AD 70. So let's listen to what he says. And I hope this comes across because the volume is a little bit poor, but let's listen to it for a second.
Now, in Zechariah chapter 14 is the text that Jesus is citing from. But of that day and that hour knows no one. Zechariah 14:7 is the day that Jesus has in mind. It shall be one day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time it shall happen, that it will be light. And in that day it shall be that living waters flow from Jerusalem. This is the language of forgiveness. This is the language of forgiveness of Zechariah 13, verse 1. In that day a fountain shall be opened for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and for sin and for uncleanness. Now, he's not referencing Pentecost. He's not referencing the cross. He's referencing a time when the city is taken. It's when forgiveness of sins is actuated and heaven is opened. That's what this language is. Now, we know in Acts chapter 16 that the
Okay, let's hold on for a minute there and let's go back. He quoted from Zechariah 14 right here. Come on, baby. Okay, there. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil will take him, you'll be divided in your midst, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. The city shall be taken and the houses plundered and all that. So he goes on. And then he goes on to say, okay, in verse 7 and 8, and there shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but as evening shall be light. And on that day living waters shall flow out of Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half to the western sea, and it shall continue in summer and winter. Now he's sitting there arguing this is judgment language, and you heard him admit this is all about that day that Matthew 24 is talking about. So therefore, by direct reference, this has to be talking about the second coming. So look at this on verse 4. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east. Is that literal or not? Then the Lord my God will come and all the holy ones with him. Wow. Where do we have this reference to? Well, Paul references this in 2 Thessalonians 3, chapter 3 at the end of the chapter, about the second coming, that he will come and all his holy ones with him. And of course then in Revelations 19 we have the picture of those that are clothed in white linen. The righteous deeds of the saints are the ones who are his army that returns with him. Those are the holy ones. We can put those three together. So here he is. He's talking about the day of the Lord and a judgment. And we look at this specifically. Half the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. All right, I agree. And if we go back to chapter 12 real quick, let's look at this. The siege of Jerusalem shall be against Judah, and I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone of all the peoples. And he goes on, okay? Now here's the issue. He says this is 70 A.D. This is when these three chapters are all talking about is 70 A.D. Now, I agree that they begin to talk about the siege of Jerusalem and on that day. I agree to a certain point. He is talking about that. But let's read on. Now, he's already established this. He can't go against it anymore. He's already declared this is about that day. Let's look in verse 5. Then the clans of Judah shall say to themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem shall have strength through the Lord of hosts their God. Wow. On that day will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot in the midst of wood. Well, what happens when you put a hot pot in the middle of wood? The wood catches fire like a flaming torch among the sheaves. Everything catches fire, right? Well, Jerusalem burned up, right? And they should devour to the right and to the left and all the surrounding people, while Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place in Jerusalem. People, while Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place in Jerusalem, this cannot be talking about the day of the siege. It can't be. The inhabitants of Jerusalem did not have strength from the Lord of hosts, their God, in 70 A.D. It's talking about a different day. Why? Because while the Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place, shall again be inhabited, okay, what happened in AD 70? They were sent out, they were divided up, half the people went this way, half the people, and that was the end of Jerusalem. And what does it say? Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place in Jerusalem, and the Lord will give salvation to the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem will not surpass that of Judah. On that day, the Lord will protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So if I was to ask Holger, did God protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem in AD 70? He would say, no, there's no way. They were sieged, they were destroyed, the people divided up, led into captivity, dead, the whole works. So no, on that day, the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem was not surpassed by that of Judah. He did not protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem on that day of 70 A.D. That's why it makes it so bad. So, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on him whom they have pierced, they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as a firstborn. Here's my point on that scriptures. He used it, and the mourning that happened, of course, in AD 70 was the destruction of the temple. there was mourning and weeping over that day. There was also mourning and weeping over Jesus, who they hung on the cross by his disciples. We can apply those in both ways. But on that day, the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning for Hadad Hermon in the plain of Megiddo. The land shall mourn, each family by itself, and the house of David by itself. Okay, we can't apply that to 70 AD. It's not about 70 AD. But we know that Matthew applied that verse when they will look on him whom they were pierced, as being part of why they were judged in 70 AD, why that came on them. Now, let's go back to Zechariah 14 and look at this again. Half the city shall go out in exile and all that. On his feet shall stand. We looked at all those. On that day, here it is. Go down here. And it shall be inhabited, for there shall never be again a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. What's it going back? On the day that the city was destroyed, yes, there will never be another decree of utter destruction against Jerusalem. It will dwell in security. So when we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the great tribulation of Jerusalem, we're talking about the greatest day of tribulation that Jerusalem will ever experience. The Revelation tribulation is not about Jerusalem. It's about the tribulation that will come upon the whole world. Just as the flood came in Noah's day, came upon the whole world and created tribulation where everybody died except for those that were on the ark. The only ones were those ones that were saved. So there was that day of tribulation. But Revelations talks about persecution and tribulations and things on the church and against the church by the beast and the false prophet until God comes in and he returns and deals with the whole situation. So, again, if this is talking about the second coming, as he tries to imply was AD 70, it won't fit. The inhabitants of Jerusalem were not protected on the day. Here in verse 11, and it shall be inhabited, for there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. You can go on and read the rest of it. Then it goes into 16. Then everyone who survives of the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King of Hosts and to keep the Feast of Booths. This proves that Jerusalem is not destroyed, but in order for people to come and the nations to come year after year, they have, when they come to Jerusalem, they're going to be there to worship the Lord. Holger even talks about this. Let's go back to his thing here, and let's listen to a little bit more.
Spirits are still operating with the daughter of divination. In Acts chapter 19, we find that there were the sons of Sceva, the unclean spirit.
He goes on to talk about Satan and the devil, and that there is no Satan and devil today, and there's no of those things going on. But he is obviously very wrong and ill-informed and unexperienced, because I've been through a major amount of demonic oppression, have dealt with it and seen it in people, and have seen people delivered of demons and spirits, and so that still exists today.
Spirits are still operating. There's a time when the unclean spirits are going to be driven out of the land, and the prophetic office will come to an end. They will say in Zechariah 13, verse 5, I am no...
And this, of course, this is his interpretation of the from Zechariah 13, that the prophetic office will come to an end. And for this time period, yes, there is, but not for... especially, you don't need prophecy when Christ returns. I'm sorry. If he's there, you don't need prophecy. That's the whole point of the thing.
Prophet, I am a foreigner. They will no longer wear a robe of coarse hair to deceive, Zechariah 13:4. And Zechariah 12, 13, and 14 ought to be understood as a composite whole.
See that? He just said it. 12, 13, and 14 need to be looked at as a composite whole. There you go. You have it from him. But yet he ignored the details, the context. He had the one day of the siege, but he's talking about on another day, again, another day, when God will come and protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem, which was not AD 70. So the question is he being honest with these three chapters? No, I'm sorry, he is not.
day when they would look upon him whom they have pierced, Zechariah 12:10, which John ultimately fulfills in the second coming of Christ when every eye see him, Zechariah chapter.
Okay, again, he just said it. When every eye will see him. Every eye will see him. What does that mean in the plain Lord sense? Well, that means then every person who has eyes will be able to see when he comes. Even those who pierced him. Well, who was that pierced him? Well, technically it was the Jews. They were the one who said crucify him. They are the ones who are guilty. They are the ones. So imagine on that day that he comes and every eye sees him, including those who pierced him, the Jewish people. What happens? They see this great display of God's power and glory, like an Old Testament coming of God with the clouds and the glory, and all of those things are going on. I mean, it just shakes up this whole world. And then what? People see him. What will happen with every Jew in the world? They will look upon him whom they pierced, and they will do what? Recognize this is the same Christ and the Messiah from scriptures that they rejected 2,000 years. And again, what? They will mourn for his firstborn son. They will mourn for him because they recognize it was he who they rejected 2,000 years ago. And in this way, with one accord, all of Israel will be saved. The national and the repentance of the people will be instantaneous when they see that Christ is there.
Revelation chapter 1 and verse 9, 7 through 9. Zechariah 12, 13, and 14 is a composite whole. And because we don't know the voices of the Old Testament, we have misunderstood the language that Jesus intended to use. Now, Jesus is...
Get that? Because we don't understand the Old Testament, we don't get the language. Okay, go on.
The Jewish prophet using Jewish language about a Jewish judgment. And Sam brings up the Hebrew scholars that he cites. I very much appreciate that. I'm glad that he has an interest in reading and in scholarship. Well, here we find the answers. We find the answers to what Jesus meant at his coming. Now, in Luke's account, Luke 17, he said, Jesus would say, one would be taken and one would be left. Two women would be grinding at the mill. One taken.
And again, my position, for those, I'm sitting there listening to what he's saying, my position is that the AD 70 was all fulfilled just in that generation. All of those things came to pass. That is what the early church fathers all believed. That's what they all talked about, from Eusebius all the way back to Barnabas. They all talked about the Olivet being a fulfillment of the Olivet prophecy. So in that regard, I don't object to what he's saying here.
One left. And so we envision, because we are 21st century North Americans, with this individualistic attitude, I'm so great by myself, that somehow...
And it's kind of ironic that they do that, because you just saw that he said at the beginning of the video, and right there, he doesn't appreciate Hebrew scholars, Greek scholars, or anybody other scholars, early church fathers, or anything else. He dismisses all of them and says they're irrelevant because if they stray from the Bible, they don't count. They're not teaching. But it's ironic that they preach from the Bible and explain what they believe it teaches, and they write books and do videos and things, and they talk about what they believe the Bible says, but to dismiss all the men who did it before them as irrelevant. And the only reason they do that, of course, is because they come against their position and argue against it and prove him wrong.
Now, the 21st century black and white newspaper reading of the text means rapture at the end of time, when in fact Jesus meant no such thing.
And I agree. Those passages in there has nothing to do with the rapture. Never talked about the rapture. One being taken is judgment, one being left, and that's what we read in Zechariah 14, correct? Let's read it again real quick. Half the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. See, half the people were taken, one person was left, one person was taken. This is exactly what he is talking about.
In Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 2, in that day, verse 1, when the nations would be battled against Jerusalem, Jesus cites this in Luke chapter 21, when the armies would come around Jerusalem. He said the city shall be taken. To be taken is to be judged. One taken, one left. Zechariah 14, verse 16, it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship. The one taken is the one who is taken in judgment. The one who is left, the one who is spared.
Did you just catch that? He read that verse. Then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the king. Now, what happened after AD 70? What nations survived that came against Jerusalem? All of them. There was no army that was defeated in 70 AD that came against Jerusalem. That Roman army was one, basically Roman, made up maybe of other nations, but this was one nation that came against Jerusalem. They destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. But it says here, everyone who survives of the nations that have come against Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the king at Jerusalem. Now, so tell me, after AD 70, how many nations came to Jerusalem to worship the king? Zero? None? But you heard him quote it. Do I need to go back?
In Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 2, in that day, verse 1, when the nations would be battled against Jerusalem, Jesus cites this in Luke chapter 21, when the armies would come around Jerusalem. He said the city shall be taken. To be taken is to be judged. One taken, one left. Right. Zechariah 14, verse 16, it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship. The one taken is the one who is taken in judgment.
The
one who was left, the one who was spared. In 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 18, there was none left but Judah alone in the Assyrian captivity. In 2 Kings 17:33, they were carried away. Jesus is using national judgment language, familiar with the prophets.
Do you catch that? It was the nations that survived. He protected the inhabitants. Judah, salvation was given to Judah. He misses that whole context. He sits there and talks about, hey, adhering to the Old Testament context, but here he completely ignored the full passages. It's incredible.
Because we read the scriptures with this 21st century North American USA Today mentality. Well, this hasn't happened yet, has it? Well, we understand the nature of the event by the timing.
And that is a complete lie. You never understand the nature of something by the timing. Just because something happened, what he's actually saying is this. See, the Bible teaches a literal coming, a visible coming, a physical bodily resurrection, and it also teaches, those basic two things is what we want to get across. It teaches us those things. But, see, in 70 AD, nobody saw Christ return. There was no physical bodily resurrection of the saints. None of those things happened. But if you declare that they did happen, because the timing, according to you, says it has to happen, therefore no one saw it, therefore those events and the nature of those events has to be invisible. But yet it is Paul who says repeatedly, when Christ appears, John said, we shall see him. The angel in Acts 1, we shall see him. He himself will descend, and every eye will see him. See, he even quoted that. Every eye will see him, Revelations. But where's this cognitive dissonance coming from?
Of the event. We understand that salvation is offered by Jesus when he comes. Therefore, we understand all the prophecy of the Old Testament through him. Now,
so are we getting a clear understanding through? No, we're not. He butchered that so badly, it's not even funny.
Many people envision today that somehow there's going to be this lying down of the wolf and lying down of the lamb. Old Testament clearly predicts in the new heavens and the new earth there will be the wolf laying down with the lamb. Well, that's kingdom language. It's Hebrew hyperbole. That's what it is. But the Bible teaches that the kingdom was already present in some sense in Colossians 1:13. They were being translated into the kingdom of God, right? But they were receiving the kingdom, Hebrews 12:28. Jesus says, though, that the kingdom is coming in the fall of Jerusalem. In Luke 21, when you see these things come to pass, know ye the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. So now I understand.
So when it talks about that, the kingdom of God is nigh at hand, what it's talking about, the judgment that comes from that kingdom, that's what's coming. You will see him coming in his kingdom. It's not him coming down with this kingdom around him, and the armies and things like this. That's not what it's talking about. When it says coming in his kingdom is in heaven. He's coming into the kingdom in heaven. He's coming in being presented before God, before the Ancient of Days, and he's given the kingdom. So at his ascension, he is there in his kingdom. And so 70 AD was him coming in his kingdom. And that language is to talk about judgment. That's exactly what he's talking about. But that has nothing to do with the second coming. We know that Jesus, when he comes in judgment against the beast and the false prophet. Not against Jerusalem, not against Israel. There's the disconnect between the two contexts of Revelations and the Olivet.
Understand the nature of the kingdom. It's there, present with them on the day of Pentecost. They're receiving it in Hebrews 12:28, and yet somehow it's not yet fulfilled until all things are fulfilled in the fall of Jerusalem. So then how does it make sense that we have a new world and where the wolf is laying down the lamb? Could there be a spiritual idea that I'm missing here? Well, did not Jesus say, I say to you as sheep among wolves? And was not the persecution...
They talk about it, that is so poor. Yes, the wolf and lion, lamb, that talks about, of course, the millennial kingdom, when Jesus comes on the earth. Remember he said, Zechariah 12:16, then those nations who came against Jerusalem will come year after year to worship the king in Jerusalem. Revelations 20, and the beasts and the armies, or the armies of Satan that gathered against, they surrounded the, what? They surrounded the city that he loves, the camp of the saints. That would be Jerusalem. Here is the picture of Jerusalem being the center of the millennial, where all the kingdoms will come. It's Christ here on earth setting up his kingdom and restoring the kingdom to Israel, as what the disciples asked in Acts chapter 1. Will you at time restore this? No. Now is not the time. I'm not going to tell you the time. Now is not the time for you to know. The Father has set that time, and he has it set, but it's not for you to know when. He didn't deny it. But in Revelations 20, we have the idea of that when he comes and restores this kingdom of Israel, it will be here on earth.
Now, party, Saul of Tarsus converted.
I don't know that.
Wasn't that wolf-like spirit converted? That persecuting party now. Body is a false concept of redemption of the body. There is one body that the Bible teaches was being...
Yeah, that is a whole different subject that I will get into on my next episode when I have time. And so right here, this is where we're going to box it up and close it up. And we'll just repeat for the brevity of the sake of people understanding. He said 12, 13, 14 that it's all about 80, 70. Yet the same passages talk about what? Jerusalem being inhabited. Again being inhabited. Once it's already been destroyed, now it's going to again be inhabited. The inhabitants were protected. Salvation was given to Jerusalem and to Judah, the house of Judah. And all of those things fly in the face of the events of 80, 70. But there's this disconnect that goes in their thinking, their brain. They can't grasp that. Full preterist, because it is deception. And I'm finding now new branches. I was talking with a guy from Nicaragua who's got a ministry, and he's now presenting some of these things and saying, well, the Holy Spirit told me. It's a new revelation that I've gotten from the Lord. Sorry, that's pride. That's Satan. He's spreading the same lie all over the earth, all over people, and people are buying up because it is so close to the truth. But those basic lies is what destroys it all. And what is that basic lie? Because it's the same lie that's shared in dispensationalism. And that is the Olivet talks about the second coming. The Son of Man coming in clouds is about the second coming. That's what they both teach. That is the error that leads both of them astray. That is what causes the whole problems. That is where it all stems from. Because any argument that I get into with any full preterist on any of these websites with anybody, it all comes back to the fact that they cannot prove The second coming happened in AD 70. I got in that discussion with Bill Dolick. He brought it up. He says, and it goes to talk about the early church fathers and why we're not supposed to listen to their doctrine, da-da-da-da. We're not supposed to listen to about all of that. We don't need to trust them and their opinions. They were wrong about this. They were wrong about that. And it goes on. And I simply brought up the real simple truth. We don't go to the early church fathers for our doctrine and buy into everything that they said. We go to them to look at what they said and what they believed. And we compare what we believe against what we understand from the Bible with what they say. And we can find the errors. There are things that we agree with, there are things that we don't agree with. But the whole point of scholarship is to iron sharpens iron. When an inconsistency is brought up that does not work, we go, okay, that doesn't work. That's an inconsistency. Like what Holger did. He read Zechariah 12:16 or 14:16, right? The nations that survived that came against Jerusalem, they will come. We'll see in AD 70 the survivors were the Israelites, the Jews, not the other nations. See how that is completely twisted. That is what makes him dead wrong. And that's what we're trying to point out here and expose and show. But Bill Dolick, the other part of that is that what we learn from the early church fathers also is historical facts. So let's put it this way. We know from history Nero committed suicide in 68 AD. We know from history Jerusalem was sacked by the Romans in AD 70. From history, if Christ had returned, we would have had it recorded by men that it was a past fact, not a doctrine to learn. We're not learning the doctrine of the second coming and all that from the early church fathers. We look to them and say, hey, you said that the AD 70 was the coming of Christ. We look at the early church fathers and they said, no, that was not the second coming. That was the coming of judgment on Jerusalem and Israel, not the second coming. How many witnesses do we have to declare that for us to start believing historical fact versus a doctrine? If something is said to happen like Jesus, okay, the prophecies pointed to Jesus coming the first time. Well, if it was fulfilled, it now becomes a historical fact, not a doctrine that we hold on to. Nobody goes around saying, gee, I hope Jesus comes the first time. I'm sorry, we already know he did. It fulfilled, it becomes a historical fact. Wow. So Stephen Hochdahl and all the others, I'm sorry, you guys. It's about time to learn. All right, thank you guys for hanging out. I have no idea how long this is going on, but I appreciate you sticking with me and listening. You guys have a good night, and go to it. I will put in, of course, the links for these videos, and you can see them and see the whole debate if you haven't found them. So thanks again. You guys have a good night.